I did a big video focusing on the 7700 XT, the 7800 XT, all of their competitors, all of that, and that meant I couldn't go into as much game-by-game detail in the absolute latest games as I usually do in my big side-by-side comparison. So in this video, we're slowing it down. We're gonna look at all of these in careful detail. But why am I comparing against these specific GPUs? 7800 XT, 4070, 6950 XT. Basically, at $500, the 7800 XT is just the GPU you should buy right now. There's not a lot of direct competition. So if you want to spend a little bit more, you go up to the RTX 4070 to find the next competitor from NVIDIA, which is coming in currently at $590 to $600. Most of the models are $600 or a little bit more. So we gotta basically look at, in this video, is it worth spending $100 more to buy an RTX 4070 over the 7800 XT. But also, if we're looking at the $600 price point, AMD's previous generation of GPUs has already been discounted in price quite a bit, so the 6950 XT is only $630 right now, so that makes it another close price competitor and is the fastest card from the previous generation, so it's interesting to look at that. So that's what we're gonna be looking at in this video, and I also focus on the absolute latest games. Unreal Engine 5, Starfield, all of that, we're testing it, Baldur's Gate 3, it'll be there. Anyway, now, these GPUs are expensive, so how do you afford that? Well, one of the best things you should do is sell your old hardware in order to fund your upgrade, and that can help pay for a big chunk of the cost. And today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, offers you the simplest and fastest way to sell your GPU, and that is by selling your functioning GPU to Jawa directly for instant cash. Well, you can list your GPU yourself, manage the listing, deal with a third-party buyer, you have to wait for the buyer, manage all of that yourself. What's really cool is that you can just get an instant offer from Jawa. They're showing you some of what they might offer right here. Your GPU model might differ. And the idea here is that you're getting the convenience of you just instantly get an offer. Let me fly out of the way here. How does it work? You just tell them about your GPU model and condition for an instant offer. It just shows up right on the website. Click the button in the video description and pinned comment. You ship it to them. You'll get a free shipping label and mail them the GPU, so you are not having to pay for that shipping in. That's factored into the price already. They inspect it and make sure that everything checks out, and then you get paid, and most sellers get paid within 1 business day after the part is received. They get a lot of great reviews. A lot of comments on my channel have said people have sold their stuff on there. We're happy for that convenient way to instantly fund some of your upgrade. Anyway, we should also mention that in this particular video, we're talking about 7800 XTs as costing $500. Now that they're actually on sale, because they went on sale this morning as the time of filming, you guys are probably seeing this video tomorrow in relation to me filming, we are seeing a bunch of them available at the MSRP of $500 or slightly above. However, I should mention that the particular model I am showing off in this video was sent to me by PowerColor. That's how I got a review sample of the 7800 XT, and a huge thank you for them doing that. And it's the Red Devil version, which is one of the highest end cooler models, and does have some awesome box here too, by the way. I think this might be the limited edition one on the box. But anyway, this card looks great. It performs extremely well. But I think if some people were asking me in my reviews, I think some reviewers were using the AMD reference model, which I do think clocks lower. So do factor that in here, that I was using this at its out-of-the-box settings when I was running all of these tests. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the side-by-sides, and then I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. We're gonna start our testing in the latest games, and Unreal Engine 5 is the biggest new engine. So many game developers have committed to their future AAA titles being in this engine. However, it's very demanding in the games we've seen so far. This is Immortals of Aveum at 1440p Ultra preset, no upscaling. We see that the RTX 4070, a $600 graphics card, cannot average 60 frames per second. It hits about 51. However, the 7800 XT hits 63 FPS average through this scene. Other scenes may perform differently, which is a 24% increase over the 4070, and the 6950 XT hits 66 FPS, which is a 29% lead over the 4070. But this game, even the developers themselves, specifically, in their system requirements list and all that, mentioned, you should probably be using upscaling. And we've seen that from other Unreal Engine 5 games. So let's kick on some upscaling. This is DLSS and FSR 2 at the quality setting. And notice that all the GPUs gained massively in performance. This engine seems to respond very well to upscaling as a performance uplift. The 4070 is now hitting 81 FPS, the 7800 XT is 12% ahead of that at 91, and the 6950 XT is at 96 FPS. And image quality-wise, I do think in the fine details, especially in motion, like if you look at the character movement and things like that, I do think the DLSS upscaling did look better than what we were getting from the FSR2 image quality, but it still looked pretty good with FSR2. Immortals of Aveum at 1080p resolution. Well, if we do 1080p at the Ultra preset with no upscaling, all of these GPUs provide a good experience, with the RTX 4070 hitting about 76 FPS and the 7800 XT hitting 88 FPS, which is 16% more than that, and the 6950 XT hitting 94 FPS, 24% increase on that. The 1% lows actually offered an even larger lead for the AMD GPUs. Also, I don't think it makes sense to kick on upscaling at 1080p when you're already getting these frame rates. So we're going to leave it here. This game does have frame generation, but at least at launch, the targeting reticle was completely destroyed when using it. So I did not choose to test that here. Remnant 2 performs better than it did at launch at the Ultra preset. I think that's mostly because they broke out the virtual shadow maps and had those turned off by default now on the Ultra preset. But anyway, at 1440p Ultra, this is another demanding Unreal Engine 5 game. This uses nanite, but not lumen. Here we're seeing the 4070 is good for 60 FPS in this scene that has a lot of geometric detail. And the 7800 XT hits 74 FPS, 23% better than that. And the 6950 XT is hitting 78 FPS, which is 30% better than the 4070, but again, within a few FPS of the 7800 XT. But again, this is another game where the developers, in using Unreal Engine 5, explicitly said it was kind of designed with upscaling in mind, performance-wise. And so if we enable upscaling at the quality setting, again, DLSS and FSR2 without any frame generation enabled, the 4070 is able to hit 89 frames per second. The 7800 XT is now 12% ahead of that at 100 FPS, and the 6950 XT is hitting at 101, so basically tied with the 7800 XT. And all the GPUs are doing very well at these settings, although you could kick on frame generation on the NVIDIA GPU here. But at a 90 FPS, personally, I'd probably just keep the native resolution, but it is available. Now, at Remnant 2 1080p Ultra, we are able to get high frame rates without using upscaling. The 4070 is hitting in at 87 frames per second. And we see similar scaling relative to what we did at the upscaled 1440p results. In other words, at lower internal rendering resolutions, the 4070 is closer in performance to the 7800 XT, but at the higher internal resolution, it seemed to fall a bit behind. That could possibly be due to the lower memory bandwidth, things like that. Anyway, we're seeing 12% lead for the 7800 XT at these settings. All the GPUs doing very well, though. The last Unreal Engine 5 game we're going to test here is Layers of Fear. This game's a lot less demanding. The high preset is its highest preset. There is no Ultra in this game. But you can toggle the hardware accelerated lumen on and off. That is the RT, hardware accelerated ray tracing, on or off. If we start out at maximum settings, so 1440p high settings, no upscaling with ray tracing enabled, we do see that the 4070 is ahead of the pack with 92 FPS, the 7800 XT at 87. So honestly, single-digit percentage differences are fairly hard to notice when you're actually playing the game in a side-by-side test, but it is the first time we're seeing the 4070 pull ahead. If we turn the hardware accelerated ray tracing off, we actually see the 7800 XT only leading the 4070 by 3%, 98 FPS versus 95 FPS. So actually, it looks like the hardware accelerated ray tracing wasn't taking a massive hit against the 7800 XT, although it did hit it harder than the 4070. It's that this game in general seems to just be more favored towards NVIDIA's architecture. than it is on AMD's. At least the 4070 is much closer here, despite this still being an Unreal Engine 5 game. This one does not use Nanite. The other two did. That could be relevant. This one does use Lumen. And like I said, we're testing the hardware accelerated Lumen on versus off. If we go down to the 1080p resolution, but go up to the maximum settings again, that would be the high settings with ray tracing enabled, all of these GPUs offer a high refresh rate experience, and quite frankly, I doubt you'd really notice the difference between 125, 128, and 134 frames per second in a side-by-side test. So, yeah, I'd basically call this a tie, although the 4070 is winning by 7% over the 7800 XT, and the 6950 XT is 2% ahead of the 7800 XT. The 1% lows show similar results as well, all of them over 100. And this also shows that Unreal Engine 5 doesn't have to be an incredibly demanding engine. It depends on what you're doing with it. Again, layers of fear, smaller enclosed spaces, doesn't end up being as heavy. Again, geometric detail, we're not using Nanite. If you turn off hardware accelerated Lumen, we then see that, but go down at 1080p, we actually do see the 4070 ahead here, although it's by 2%. Once again, I'd basically call this a tie. They're all fairly close to 150 FPS, plus or minus a few. And again, I think you'd be happy with the performance on all of them. And yeah, I don't have too much more to say about that. But let's move on to the absolute latest game, Starfield. As of filming this, there still has not been another patch or driver for these, so this is the the September 1st version of the game. 1440p Ultra preset, but turning FSR upscaling off and variable rate shading off, just so that doesn't mess with any of our results. We see the AMD GPUs crushing the 4070. The 4070 cannot give you even 50 FPS. It's 48 average in New Atlantis. Other scenes in this game are a lot easier to run, but there are several that are this difficult. It's a 38% lead for the 7800 XT over the 4070, and the 7800 XT is able to deliver well over 60 FPS average in this demanding area. However, I also tested it out using the game's actual Ultra preset, which does include FSR, although I left variable rate shading off to just not have that behave differently on the different GPUs or anything. So this is FSR at the 75% number, which does get the 4070 to 56, but it's still below 60 FPS, where the 7800 XT is up at 76, and the 6950 XT is at 79. So this is a very large lead for the AMD GPUs, but if you watch my Starfield dedicated video on GPU comparisons, while I didn't have the 7800 XT and 6950 XT in that particular video, we did generally see AMD outperforming NVIDIA in this game. So unless there is some kind of major driver update or major game optimization in NVIDIA's favor, it certainly looks like if Starfield is going to be the next game you sink 5,000 hours into, maybe going with the 7800 XT over the 4070 would make a lot of sense if this was the game you were targeting. Again here, this is 1440p high settings, but no upscaling. And notice we get very similar performance to the Ultra settings with FSR at 75%. And very similar scaling with the 7800 XT 40% ahead of the 4070, and the 4070 still not hitting 60 frames per second. In fact, going down to 1080p Ultra settings, but turning off any upscaling, so it's native 1080p Ultra, still variable rate shading off. The 4070 is finally almost averaging 60 frames per second, although technically it drops to 59 by the end of my little benchmark pass. And the 7800 XT is hitting 79 FPS, and the 6950 XT is hitting 82. So that's a 34% lead over the RTX 4070, even at 1080p. And again, that is a very large and noticeable margin here. And like I said, I really hope we see more optimization for NVIDIA in this game at some time in the future. I was even curious, can the 4070 hit good frame rates if we go down to high settings even at 1080p. And so finally, at high settings 1080p, our $600 4070 is able to hit 70 frames per second in the city here. 7800 XT is now leading by 26% at 88 FPS. 6950 XT at 92 FPS, but it is possible we're hitting a little more CPU limitation here. The GPUs can drop into the mid 90% utilization range, and even my 7800 X3D system that I'm using here can top her out in the 90 or so FPS range in big cities like that. So it's possible that was impacting the AMD GPUs there from hitting even higher frame rates. But let's move to Ratchet and Clank, where I said that Starfield was a big one for the AMD GPUs. Ratchet and Clank seems to be a bit tougher on AMD GPUs here. We're seeing the 7800 XT and the 6950 XT leading the 4070 by only a few frames per second, 4% and 9% lead respectively. And this is without ray tracing enabled. This is 1440p at the very high preset, no upscaling, no dynamic resolution scaling, but they're all offering a great experience. It was a high refresh rate, well over 100 FPS. If we then actually crank up the ray tracing settings in this game, and I'll be honest here, if you tweak the ray tracing settings and don't just blast everything to max, like I'm doing here, GPUs will perform a lot better, especially the AMD GPUs, better than what they're showing here. But this is everything cranked and no upscaling. We're seeing the 4070 can do it at 64 FPS through this scene, whereas the 7800 XT is down at 42 and the 6950 XT is hitting 50. So definitely if you want to crank native no upscaling ray tracing heavily in a game like this, it certainly is a large lead for the 4070. However, if we do enable upscaling, the AMD GPUs actually do offer good frame rates now with 77 and 76, so basically tied on our AMD GPUs in the comparison, whereas the 4070 is high refresh rate now at 101 FPS through the scene, which is a 31% lead over the 6950 XT and basically the same lead over the 7800 XT. So again, large lead. Also image quality wise, in motion, and especially, I don't think this shows a lot of the hair rendering, but the fine details, edges of things like that, with the upscaling, I do think DLSS had the image quality edge. Going down to 1080p, maxed out settings, very high ray tracing, all of the GPUs actually perform well here, but once again, the 4070 has a large lead. It's a 33% lead, and I have not enabled frame generation on any of this testing. And the 4070, I believe, does have frame generation supported in this game, which again has its own pros and cons. I've talked about that a lot in other videos. I'm not going to focus too much on frame generation in this video, mostly because AMD's FSR 3 should be coming soon, and it kind of makes sense to give them that before we do too much on the head-to-heads right now with frame generation. 1080p at the very high settings, so not enabling maxed out ray tracing. All of these GPUs are performing extremely well, and it's possible we're hitting a bit of CPU limitation, at least in some areas, and they're all basically tied in this, 160 plus up to 170-ish frame rate at 1080p very high settings. So again, this game, when you're not cranking ray tracing, is not particularly demanding. Baldur's Gate 3 is another brand new game, and a lot of people are playing it, and good news is it's not that demanding on the GPU. We do see the 6950 XT doing a lot better than the 7800 XT compared to the other games we've looked at, but both of them are leading the 4070, but all of them are delivering way more than any performance level you would need to play a top-down turn-based game like this at 1440p maxed out ultra settings. They're all, the 4070 is doing the worst, and it's 125 FPS. If we go down to 1080p max settings, we're pushing over 200 FPS on the 6950 XT, 7800 XT hitting 189, and the 4070 is only going to get you 169 FPS here. You're much more likely to see issues with your CPU in this game. All of these GPUs are going to crush it, but if you're getting performance issues in this game, it's likely you're in a highly populated area, especially like the third act or the bigger city areas, or just areas where there's a lot of characters on screen, and it's more likely a CPU limitation in the game. Let's go to Jedi Survivor. Now, as I'm filming this, it looks like there was just a brand new patch on this game that introduced DLSS to the game, but this was tested a week or so ago while I was working on my reviews, and that patch was not available at that time. So anyway, I haven't retested the game since then, but here we're seeing at 1440p maximum settings, so epic with ray tracing on, the GPUs are all basically tied. The 4070 is offering 69 nice FPS, and the 7800 XT is 1 FPS behind it. The 6950 XT was 1 FPS ahead. But if we turn off ray tracing and drop down to the high preset, so a lot of people say don't play games at ultra, play at high. Okay, here's the high preset, no ray tracing. Now we are seeing all of them giving a higher refresh rate experience, 80, 90, and 98, with the 4070 behind, 7800 XT taking the second place, 6950 XT in first place. And that's a 13% lead for the 7800 XT over the 4070. And the 6950 XT is a bit more of a noticeable win here over the 7800 XT than we've seen in some of our other titles. Dropping down to 1080p resolution, going back to the epic maxed out settings with ray tracing enabled, they are all once again basically tied. I don't think you'd really notice which one you were using, but the 4070 does have the largest lead, including in the 1% lows by a slightly larger margin, 18% lead in the 1% lows for the 4070 over the 7800 XT, but only 5% in the average frame rate. But they are all giving a very good experience here. Let's jump over to Resident Evil 4 Remake, and at its maximum preset, it does enable ray tracing. And despite ray tracing being enabled, the 7800 XT is 4% ahead of the 4070. The AMD GPUs are also showing more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM usage. So it is possible that that's factoring in here a little bit, but they're all basically tied at around 100 frames per second. So pretty similar experience on all of the GPUs. If we go to the prioritize graphics preset, which is the next preset down, it disables ray tracing and turns down some other features that use a lot of VRAM. And now we're actually seeing the 6950 XT pull to a wider lead, 24% over the 4070, and the 7800 XT is only 9% over the 4070. So a bit of a wider spread at these settings. You guys might be noticing in some of these that the capture card on the 4070 had some of the settings a little bit off, making it look washed out. Don't worry, it's not NVIDIA producing a worse image, it's just the capture card settings. I record externally on a different PC, and I must have just clicked the wrong button on something when I was setting up my capture card that day and didn't notice it till I put the footage side by side. At 1080p at the maximum settings, they're all basically tied at 125, 128, 128. So again, another game where if you're not doing a heavy ray tracing workload, the 4070 does pull even with them when you enable ray tracing, but doesn't really take the lead. We'll also take a look at The Last of Us Part 1, which has been recently patched again. A lot of updates have happened to this game. It performs a lot better than it did at launch. Anyway, at 1440p Ultra, we are seeing the GPUs doing well here. The 4070 is hitting 81 FPS with the 7800 XT at 88 and the 6950 XT at 92. That means the 7800 XT has a 9% lead over the 4070 and the 6950 XT has a 14% lead over the 4070, and the 7800 XT and the 6950 XT are only different by 4 frames per second, which at this high of a frame rate, not that big of a deal. If we drop down to the high preset, the 4070 is hitting 98 FPS now, so big jump dropping down to the high preset, and the game still looks very good. 7800 XT hitting 108, and the 6950 XT hitting 116. It's interesting, I was trying to look to see if we were hitting any CPU limit here, but it looks like the GPUs are staying around 99% utilized for the most part, so I think we're still showing the GPU performance here. 1% lows are maybe a little interesting. We do see a 10% lead for the 7800 XT over the 4070 here. If we drop down to 1080p Ultra, we see again at the lower resolution, the 4070 does perform closer to what we're getting from our AMD GPUs here. Now with the 7800 XT only at a 5% lead over the 4070. And 6950 XT with an 8% lead over the 4070. We're talking they're all close to 120 frames per second. So they're all doing very well here. Let's pop out and give you some final thoughts. So do you buy the 7800 XT? Well, if your budget is $500, absolutely yes. The question really is it worth spending $100 more to get something else? And first of all, let me answer that question about its AMD competitor, the 6950 XT. I don't think that's worth the extra $130 that it costs on the current market. Doesn't make sense. It draws more power. It doesn't have AV1 encoding. Some of the newest AMD features are going to run better or even exclusively on the 7000 series, little things to do with like Hyper RX, Anti-Lag Plus versus the normal anti-lag. And there's questions on whether FSR 3 might even be accelerated better on the newer generation, question mark. Anyway, the point is, I just don't think the 6950 XT makes sense against the 7800 XT. Save yourself 130 bucks. The 4070 is a much more interesting question. Now, this one's going to come down to the nuances, because I think, honestly, it's very easy to just say the 7800 XT is generally outperforming it, and it costs less. Buy yourself a 7800 XT. And hey, if you're going to be playing a lot of Starfield, like I said, I know like people with the thousands of hours on Skyrim and all that, if this is your next game, I mean, there you go. Grab yourself the 7800 XT. But again, this is where it's situational. The 4070 does have some things going for it that could be worth $100 extra to a certain set of people. You need to figure out if you are in this set of people, okay? So everybody plays different games. Everybody plays them differently. Personally, I mean, a lot of the games I'm playing right now, like Baldur's Gate 3, I'm going to be spending a lot of time in that. There's no ray tracing. Remnant 2, there's no ray tracing, and in Unreal Engine 5, we're seeing some big leads for the 7800 XT, right? Immortals of Aveum, there's no dedicated hardware RT version of the Lumen in this game. So, you know, a lot of the new games coming out right now, no ray tracing, the 7800 XT gets good frame rates. Yeah, awesome. Let's just go ahead and do that. However, some people are literally going to always turn on upscaling at the quality setting if they're running an NVIDIA GPU. If DLSS quality offers really good image quality, close to native, and it does offer a healthy boost in performance, then a lot of people will just generally enable this by default. And personally, you know, I'm more likely, if a game, how should I put this? You know, while FSR 2 quality doesn't look that much worse than DLSS quality, it does look worse. And that means I'm more likely to turn on DLSS than I am to turn on FSR. That's just the case. And so a lot of times, if you think about optimized settings for a game, right? I'm not one of the people who think that DLSS generally looks better than native, but I do think it looks very close to native. And it's often, if you just think of it as any other graphic setting, I would often very frequently turn on DLSS at the quality setting to gain a big boost to performance without much of a hit to visual quality. And I'm less likely to do that with FSR2 because it feels like I'm taking a slightly higher hit to visual quality. And when you do that, if you look at like the frame rate of running Immortals of Aveum with DLSS quality enabled, 81, it's still losing to the 7800 XT when it's running FSR2 quality. But if you compare it to the 7800 XT when it's not upscaling, that's down here at 63. So in other words, we see a lot of games right now that seem to be designed with most of the graphic settings optimization that they offer, if you want to even call it optimization, is upscaling. Immortals of Aveum is a lot like that. Remnant 2 is a lot like that. Heck, Starfield doesn't offer a lot of actual just like low settings to ultra setting scalability, and it builds FSR upscaling into its presets. We do see a growing trend of games that seem to be designed to play with upscaling on. And if you are going to play with upscaling on, DLSS does offer the better upscaler. And so that, I think, is where a lot of the value of the 4070 being worth $100 extra might come into play for you. Now, there's also the DLSS 3 frame generation thing, and I really want to hold off and wait for FSR 3 to be available before we talk too much more about that, because we should be seeing FSR 3 in games like Immortals of Aveum and Forspoken coming, they said early fall, so hopefully very, very soon. And then we could get an idea of how it compares to DLSS frame generation. DLSS frame generation is situational because there's an impact to latency because it delays showing you a real frame to insert a generated frame. You're not going to want to use it in competitive games. And it can have an image quality compromise. In Immortals of Aveum, for example, if you watch my video testing that game out on a variety of GPUs, you'll see that the crosshairs have a lot of ghosting happening. And other games have similar issues, but in other games it works very well. But what it's basically providing you, I wouldn't really consider increased performance because it doesn't make the game more responsive. I would consider it increased motion fluidity. So it does a good job of helping you take advantage of a high refresh rate monitor to get a nice smooth camera panning, look, that kind of stuff that you wouldn't get at a lower frame rate, but you want a high enough base frame rate for it to look good and to feel responsive. So maybe even already 60 FPS, the game needs to support it. Not every game does. And again, it has to be a game where you're getting good enough performance and would want to enable it and doesn't have egregious image quality artifacting. So it's a situational feature that's cool. I'm interested to see how FSR 3 competes. So for now, I'm going to say for some people, that's going to be a cool value add again for the 4070. And if you do enable frame generation, in games that support it, you will generally have the 4070 offering a higher frame rate than the 7800 XT without frame generation, but that high frame rate number doesn't really correspond to that same frame rate number when it's not achieved through frame generation. So that's really hard to put a hard number on in a value proposition in a video like this. But the standard reconstruction algorithm, DLSS does look a little bit better than FSR2, so if you're going to be using upscaling, there's a bit of an argument for that. And FSR 3 upscaling, AMD has said that improving the image quality of the upscaling algorithm was not the main focus. It was a focus on adding in their AMD Fluid Motion frames, their competitor to the generated frames, frame generation. So I doubt the image quality of the reconstruction is gonna change there. So bit of value add there on the 4070, and the other big obvious one is the power consumption. It is a very large difference in power consumption. And for some people, that means that you don't need to buy a bigger power supply, which then eats into the cost difference, right? But if your power supply can support both of them, then it financially hits you maybe a little bit on your energy bill. Maybe you live in a super high energy area. It's probably going to take a long time and you have to game a lot for that to eat up a $100 price gap, right? But something to think about. Also, if you live in a high temperature area, one thing to point out, a lot of people misunderstand, this says 60 Celsius. That says 61 Celsius. So is the 4070 putting out about the same or even slightly more heat into your case? Absolutely not. The 7800 XT is putting out more heat into your case because the watts are how much heat is going out into your case and therefore your bedroom or office or wherever you have your PC. The cooler is trying to push the heat off of the GPU, which keeps the GPU cool, but more energy, more watts means more heat exiting the card regardless of the temperature the GPU is running at. Which means that if you live in a hot environment, maybe you lack air conditioning, that kind of a thing, the 40s, or maybe your just PC case doesn't have great cooling, the 4070 should also put out less heat into your environment. So like I said, there's a lot of these little feature set advantages for the NVIDIA GPU. Productivity workloads I'm not focusing on here, but there are some that are more designed for the market share leader, which is NVIDIA, so they're more tuned for NVIDIA's CUDA cores, that kind of thing, a lot of AI workloads, all of that. So there's definitely those kinds of advantages. There's also the ray tracing advantage, which we can talk about a bit here, but notice that because the 7800 XT is generally faster than the 4070, it does mean that then when the ray tracing workload isn't particularly demanding, the 7800 XT is still hanging in there, either losing by a few percent or like we saw in Layers of Fear with the hardware accelerated Lumen, or we had games like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, where they're basically tied with ray tracing enabled. And the thing is, a lot of games are programmed with consoles as their main focus for development. Consoles don't have a lot of ray tracing performance. They have less than the 7800 XT does. So a lot of times they won't be programmed with a heavy ray tracing workload. And when that's the case, you're actually not getting a better experience on the 4070, or at least not by much. Oftentimes basically tied. We saw that again in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Very similar performance with ray tracing enabled. But there are some games that do, for the PC, offer a higher level of ray tracing, like when I cranked all of the settings in Ratchet and Clank, and we saw a 50% advantage for the 4070. You can see things like that happen when Cyberpunk, RT Ultra, RT Overdrive, Cyberpunk's getting a new expansion out, right? If you're gonna wanna play that with RT Overdrive, you're definitely gonna be upscaling, which will look better on the NVIDIA GPU, and if you're cranking the ray tracing settings, the 4070 will offer better performance, right? So there are situations where the 4070 is able to do something better, or that the 7800 XT just can't even realistically do. So definitely something to think about there. But does that mean you should buy the 4070 over the 7800 XT when in many, many games there's no ray tracing, the 7800 XT is getting such good performance without upscaling that maybe you wouldn't even enable it, and it costs $100 less. So I think for a lot of people, let me put it this way. I think the 7800 XT absolutely offers better value. There's no question on that. I think if the 7800 XT and the 4070 cost the same, if they were both $500, I mean, NVIDIA, can we please get the 4070 down to like 500? I know it's probably too much to ask from a company that's just raking in billions or trillions or whatever it is on AI right now. Then this would be more of a toss-up between features. A little bit more raw performance or better feature set, pick your poison if they cost about the same. And that's where we've been in the past between the 4070 and the 6950 XT, because those cost about the same. But with 7800 XT costing $100 less, it just really is the more compelling value. But again, if you can scale up to $100 and that's not a problem for you, the question is just, should you? Again, think about your game playing, your feature set. Are you somebody who would usually play with upscaling enabled? Then maybe the 4070 is the better deal, right? Are you somebody who plays the single player titles and you want to crank the ray tracing settings and you're going to upscale to do that, right? So there is an argument for the 4070, but you have to reach for it being situational, right? So the 4070 is not in general better than the 7800 XT, but it does some things better than the 7800 XT. Last thing I can mention is the 7800 XT does have 16 gigabytes of VRAM versus 12 on the 4070. Right now, that's not showing as a big deal at 1080p or 1440p, but in general, in the future, VRAM usage tends to go up over time, and there are definitely games that are right at that 12 gigabytes right now. We're already seeing that in things like Ratchet and Clank. So anyway, definitely something to keep your eye on in the future. Hopefully this was useful. I know some of you probably wanted me to just say, buy the 4070 or buy the 7800 XT. But again, it's situational. It really depends on what you're going to prefer out of those features. Also, personally, I'd kind of wait and see what we get out of FSR 3. That's a question mark, and hopefully we'll see it soon. You don't have to rush out and buy something right this minute, right? Anyway, hopefully you guys found this video useful and interesting to go into all of the detail, all of the depth, all of that. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.